This castle was not a dream. It was a mistake, not because it collapsed, not because it bankrupted anyone, but because once it began, it could not be stopped without consequences. Stone remembers intention, walls retain promises, and this one was built to hold something no structure can safely contain: love. Before anyone spoke its name, before guidebooks and postcards and restoration committees, the island was already under pressure. Every shipment that arrived carried more than granite. Every scaffold raised another silent obligation. This place wasn't meant to be lived in. It was meant to prove something, and proof, once demanded, is never satisfied. The danger wasn't abandonment. The danger was completion. No one on the island questioned the order of things. Work arrived by boat each morning. Tools rang against stone. Plans changed daily, growing larger, heavier, more demanding. The castle did not rise. It accumulated. Corridors widened. Towers multiplied. Rooms appeared whose purpose no one could fully explain, except that they had to exist, because once the idea was conceived, restraint was no longer an option. That was the first invisible cost: scale without resistance. But something else was happening beneath the noise. The island itself was being reshaped to obey a private emotion. Shorelines were altered, foundations drilled deeper than necessary. Supporting buildings, powerhouses, tunnels, servant quarters spread quietly, away from the romantic silhouette. The visible castle was only the surface. Underneath it, a system was forming. And systems don't stop just because feelings do. That was the problem no one wanted to name. Every day the structure demanded more coordination, more labor, more silence. Workers did not discuss why the castle existed. They discussed measurement, load limits, timelines that were never written down but somehow always urgent. This wasn't architecture anymore. It was momentum. And momentum does not grieve. Somewhere far from the island, something failed that had nothing to do with stone. A heart weakened gradually, unnoticed by the rhythms of construction. When it finally stopped, the island didn't know yet. The tools kept moving. The walls kept rising. The castle continued believing in a future that no longer existed. When the message arrived, it didn't explain. It didn't justify. It didn't soften the impact. It simply removed the future. Stop. No contingency had been designed for this. No protocol for sudden emotional absence. Hundreds of hands froze at once, as if the island itself had lost power. Not slowly, not ceremonially, immediately. The system, so carefully built, was ordered to die in mid-breath. And that is when the second cost appeared. An unfinished structure is not neutral. It does not pause. It decays with intent. Water finds openings that were never sealed. Iron rusts where it was meant to be hidden. Wood warps before it learns its purpose. The castle didn't wait. It reacted. People left quickly. Silence moved in faster than expected. What remained was not a ruin, but a question made of stone. What happens when a monument outlives its reason? For years, the island absorbed neglect like a second construction phase, one run by weather, vandals, and time. Windows shattered, floors collapsed, ornamental details became liabilities. The same ambition that once demanded perfection now guaranteed exposure. Nothing here was modest enough to disappear quietly, and still, the structure refused to vanish. That refusal created a new tension. If the castle could not fulfill its original purpose, then what was it allowed to become? A warning? A shrine? A tourist attraction? Each answer carried its own cost, its own distortion of the original intent. Restoring it would mean continuing the story. Leaving it alone would mean letting the system rot publicly. Neither option was innocent. What no one admitted, then or now, is that the castle was never about living. It was about permanence, about freezing a feeling in a form that time could not argue with. And time took that personally, because time always does. Even now, as visitors cross the water and step onto the island, they feel it before they understand it. The scale is wrong. The proportions feel defensive. The rooms expect something that never arrives. This place is not waiting. It is holding. Holding what, exactly? That question is the real inheritance of the castle, and it wasn't answered when the tools stopped. It only grew louder as the years passed. Because if a building is designed as a promise, and the promise is broken, who carries the debt? The castle did not become empty all at once. That's the lie told by postcards and restoration plaques. In reality, emptiness seeped in gradually, like moisture through unfinished stone. First came the absence of authority. No owner returned to decide what stayed or went. No voice corrected decay. Without intention, even order becomes unstable. Caretakers were never appointed. Guards were unnecessary at first. There was nothing to steal that could be sold easily. What value does a half-built ballroom have? What market exists for staircases that lead nowhere? The castle's size protected it temporarily, not through strength, but through inconvenience. It was too large to loot quickly, too complex to understand. That protection didn't last. Weather arrived with patience. Snow collected in roofless towers. Freeze and thaw widened cracks meant to be sealed later. Rain followed gravity into places that had never been tested. Floors designed to support chandeliers instead carried standing water. Every season completed what construction had paused. This was the third cost: exposure. Local boatmen were the first to realize the island was changing, not because of vandalism, but because of sound. Wind through broken arches produces a different echo than wind through finished halls. The castle had developed a voice, and it wasn't welcoming. Still, curiosity outweighed caution. Visitors came, then locals, then strangers. What they encountered was not romance. It was abundance without context. Marble waiting for hands that would never touch it. Fireplaces that had never been lit, already stained with soot from trespassers' fires. Doors hung but unopened, their purpose hypothetical. The castle wasn't frozen in time. It was drifting, and drift invites intervention. Without rules, people impose their own. Names were carved into stone. Fixtures were torn out as souvenirs. Windows shattered not out of malice, but proof. Proof that someone had been there. Proof that the place was no longer sacred. Every act left a mark, and marks accumulated faster than memory. This is where the story usually turns sentimental. It shouldn't, because the castle wasn't being harmed randomly. It was being dismantled logically. Valuable metals disappeared first. Copper wiring, iron fixtures, then anything portable enough to justify effort. The process mirrored construction in reverse. Piece by piece, quietly, efficiently. No one stopped it because stopping it required agreement on what the castle was supposed to be now, and no one could answer that. Ownership had become theoretical. Responsibility had dissolved across jurisdictions. The island sat in water that connected countries, governments, and laws that overlapped without clarity. The castle existed in a legal fog, and fog protects decay. Meanwhile, the structure itself began adapting. Load-bearing elements settled unevenly. Staircases strained under stresses they were never designed to bear alone. Decorative stone, meant to be superficial, became structural by default. This kind of adaptation looks like resilience, but it's not. It's compensation. Compensation always fails eventually. By the time officials began to notice, the damage was no longer cosmetic. Entire sections were compromised. Towers leaned imperceptibly. Floors sagged. The castle was becoming dangerous not because it was old, but because it was incomplete. An unfinished system cannot age safely. It was never taught how, and yet even then no decisive action was taken. Why? Because the castle still performed one function flawlessly. It attracted attention. Attention creates hesitation. Hesitation delays decisions, and delay feels harmless when the damage is slow enough to normalize. The island became a backdrop for stories no one verified. Lovers, ghosts, curses. Each myth made the real issue easier to ignore. If the castle was haunted, then neglect felt inevitable. If it was tragic, decay felt appropriate. Narrative replaced maintenance. That was the fourth cost. Mythology. Mythology absolves responsibility by turning failure into fate. But structures do not believe in fate. They respond only to force and neglect. And neglect had become systematic. Every winter worsened the imbalance. Every summer exposed new weaknesses. The castle wasn't waiting to be saved. It was approaching a threshold. Past that threshold, restoration would no longer be possible. Only reconstruction. And reconstruction is not preservation. It's replacement with memory as justification. That possibility frightened people. Not because they loved the castle, but because losing it would expose how long it had been ignored. How many chances had passed unnoticed. How convenient the tragedy had been. So discussions began. Committees formed. Plans were proposed carefully, cautiously, always framed as respect. But beneath every proposal was the same unresolved question. Was saving the castle an act of honor or an act of denial? Because restoring it meant continuing a promise that had already failed once, and continuing it would require rewriting intent, not recovering it. The castle had been built to hold a private meaning. Turning it public didn't erase that origin. It distorted it. Every repaired wall would carry a contradiction. Every restored room would ask why it was being finished now, by strangers, for reasons unrelated to the original vow. That tension never went away. It simply waited. And the longer it waited, the more expensive the answer became. Restoration did not begin as an act of love. That story came later, polished and simplified. At first, it was fear disguised as responsibility. Fear that the structure would cross a point of no return. Fear that collapse would force accountability on people who had benefited from delay. Fear that letting it die would look like a decision, not an accident. So the first repairs were cautious, almost apologetic. Stabilize, not complete. Reinforce, not restore. The goal was not to finish the castle but to stop it from embarrassing everyone involved. Temporary measures became permanent solutions. Permanent solutions avoided uncomfortable questions. This was the fifth cost: intervention without intention. Engineers approached the structure like a patient whose medical history was missing. Load paths were unclear. Materials varied by section. Some walls had been designed as ornament and now carried weight they were never meant to bear. Fixing one problem risked creating another. Every solution exposed how improvisational the original ambition had been. And still, visitors came. They walked through rooms that had never decided what they were. They admired staircases that were impressive precisely because they served no daily function. The absence of domestic logic became part of the appeal. This wasn't a house. It was a performance frozen mid-act. People didn't ask how it would feel to live here. They asked how it felt to imagine living here. That distinction mattered, because imagination is cheap. Maintenance is not. As restoration expanded, so did the contradiction. To make the castle safe, systems had to be added that never existed in the original vision. Electrical lines, safety railings, structural reinforcements, modern necessities threading through a structure built to reject practicality. Each addition solved a problem while creating another. Authenticity. At what point does preservation become fabrication? The castle's public identity began to stabilize just as its private meaning dissolved completely. It was no longer a promise interrupted. It was a symbol curated. Tragedy was framed. Loss was contained. The narrative became manageable. But systems remember what narratives erase. Behind restored walls, stress continued to accumulate. Some sections could not be brought up to modern standards without being fundamentally altered. Others were left untouched, quietly aging faster than the repaired areas. The building began to split into timelines, one preserved, one deteriorating. Visitors rarely noticed the seams. Engineers always did. This duality created a silent pressure. Money flowed unevenly. Attention followed spectacle, not necessity. Iconic spaces were prioritized. Invisible infrastructure waited. That waiting carried risk. Deferred maintenance always does. And then there was the island itself. Hart Island had been reshaped for a single purpose, and then repurposed without redesign. Pathways, docks, service buildings, all inherited assumptions that no longer applied. Logistics became fragile. Weather disruptions grew more costly. Every improvement required negotiation between preservation and practicality. None of this appeared on brochures. What appeared was romance, the idea of devotion immortalized in stone. A story that ended cleanly without discussing what came after interruption. Visitors left with a feeling, not an understanding. Feelings don't fund long-term stability. Understanding sometimes does. But understanding requires discomfort. It requires admitting that the castle was never efficient, never sustainable, never neutral. It was extravagant by design and fragile by consequence. Turning it into a public monument did not remove those traits. It redistributed them. The burden shifted from one family to an institution, from private grief to public management, from emotional risk to financial risk. The scale remained the same. Only the payer changed, and pay they did. Every year, upkeep demanded more resources than a practical structure of similar size would ever justify, not because of extravagance, but because of irregularity. Custom stonework requires custom solutions. Unfinished designs resist standardization. The castle punished anyone who tried to treat it like a normal building. This was not an accident. It was embedded from the beginning. Yet the narrative persisted, saved from ruin, rescued from time, as if time had attacked it unfairly. rather than responding exactly as expected to an unfinished system left exposed. What few acknowledged was that restoration did not resolve the original tension. It preserved it. The castle remained a space built for a single, absent presence. No amount of public access could fill that void. Instead, the void became the attraction. People came to feel absent. That feeling was carefully managed, safely packaged, but it never fully behaved. Some rooms felt wrong despite perfect repair. Some corridors seemed to narrow emotionally the longer one stood in them, not because of ghosts, but because design communicates intention, even when intention has expired. The castle still speaks in the language of exclusivity and excess. It still demands disproportionate resources. It still resists adaptation. These are not flaws introduced by abandonment. They are features inherited from conception. And that raises a question that restoration never answered. If the structure was flawed from the moment it was imagined, what exactly was being saved? The building? Or the story people needed it to tell? Because those are not the same thing, and choosing one over the other always creates a debt. A debt that doesn't disappear just because the walls look whole again. What the castle never escaped was comparison. Every visitor brought another one. Compared to homes meant to be lived in, it felt excessive. Compared to monuments meant to endure, it felt fragile. Compared to ruins meant to decay, it felt artificially preserved. The structure existed in between categories, and that ambiguity created unease. Buildings are supposed to know what they are. This one never did. That confusion wasn't accidental. It came from intent without limits. The original design had no economic ceiling because it wasn't responding to need. It was responding to emotion. Emotion does not negotiate with constraints. It escalates. Every additional tower, every widened hall, every unnecessary flourish was not indulgent. It was escalation. And escalation, once normalized, becomes expectation. That expectation lingered long after construction stopped. Restoration teams inherited it without ever agreeing to it. Each decision, what to repair, what to leave incomplete, was measured against a standard that had never been written down. Finish too much, and the castle becomes a lie. Finish too little, and it becomes unsafe. The balance was unstable, and instability demands constant correction. This is where cost stopped being financial and became structural. The castle required perpetual decision-making, not occasional maintenance, but continuous judgment. Judgment costs time. It costs expertise. It costs consensus. And consensus is slow, especially when history is involved. Every choice reopened the same argument: fidelity to the past versus responsibility to the present. No one won that argument. They just managed it. What made the situation more complex was visibility. The castle is not hidden. It sits exposed, framed by water and sky, impossible to ignore. Failure here would not be quiet. It would be photographed, documented, interpreted. Letting it decline again would look intentional, even if it wasn't. So decline had to be prevented, at any cost. That phrase is dangerous, because any cost is how the original project justified itself. The castle, in that sense, became self-replicating. Its past logic infected its future. Each generation of caretakers faced the same trap. Admitting limits felt like betrayal. Pushing forward felt safer, even when unsustainable. This is the hidden symmetry of the structure. It teaches the same behavior it was born from. Visitors sense this, even if they can't articulate it. They walk through spaces that feel unresolved. They notice doors that imply rooms that don't exist, windows that frame nothing but water. The castle communicates incompletion as a permanent condition, not a flaw to be fixed, but a state to be managed. And management never ends. Over time, the narrative adjusted again. The castle stopped being about loss and started being about survival, about rescue, about triumph over decay. This reframing made continued investment easier to justify. It also quietly erased responsibility for why the decay had been inevitable in the first place. Survival stories are comforting. They suggest redemption without reckoning. But reckoning was still embedded in the stone. Every inspection revealed the same truth in different language. This building was not designed to rest. It was designed to impress. Structures like that demand attention forever or collapse spectacularly. There is no stable middle ground, so attention was given, year after year. Quietly, expensively. What changed was who bore the weight. Originally, the cost was personal. Then it became institutional. Now it is cultural. The castle is no longer maintained because someone needs it. It is maintained because people expect it to exist. Expectation is a powerful force. It rarely asks permission. It rarely considers sustainability. Expectation just accumulates. This is where the castle's real tragedy lives, not in abandonment, but in obligation without endpoint. A promise that cannot be fulfilled but also cannot be withdrawn. A structure that cannot justify itself through use, only through meaning. And meaning is fragile. If public interest wanes, the justification weakens. If funding priorities shift, maintenance becomes negotiable. If a single major failure occurs, the conversation changes overnight. Suddenly, preservation becomes triage. Triage becomes acceptance. Acceptance becomes loss. The castle has survived this long because it exists just before that threshold. Just before. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Is survival the same as success? Or is it simply delay? Because delay has a cost, too. It transfers responsibility forward to people who did not choose the original decision, but must live with its consequences. The castle does not ask whether they consent. It only asks whether they will pay. And so far, they have. But systems built on expectation eventually face fatigue, not dramatic collapse, gradual disengagement, fewer resources, slower responses, deferred decisions. The same pattern that once nearly destroyed the castle could return, not through neglect, but through exhaustion. That possibility is never advertised, but it's always present. The castle still stands. The walls look solid. The story feels complete. But none of that guarantees permanence, because permanence was the illusion that created the problem in the first place. And illusions, no matter how carefully maintained, eventually demand a reckoning. The final cost was never listed in budgets or reports. It didn't appear in engineering assessments or visitor statistics. It surfaced quietly, in the way the castle reshaped how people understood legacy. Because Boldt Castle no longer belongs to the man who imagined it, nor to the woman it was meant to honor. It belongs to time, and time is an unreliable curator. Every generation that encounters the castle interprets it differently. Some see devotion, others see excess. Some see tragedy softened by restoration. Others see a warning disguised as romance. None of these readings are wrong, but none of them are complete. The problem is that the structure invites interpretation without offering resolution. It looks finished enough to feel intentional, incomplete enough to feel interrupted, maintained enough to feel safe, unstable enough to feel temporary. This ambiguity keeps the castle alive culturally, but it also keeps it unsettled. Buildings that last usually do so because their purpose is clear. This one survives because its purpose is contested, and contested meaning is heavy. It requires constant explanation, plaques, tours, narratives adjusted for tone, loss framed gently, excess excused emotionally. The story must be retold carefully every time, or it risks collapsing under scrutiny. Why so large? Why unfinished? Why preserved at all? Each answer redirects, never concludes. That redirection is intentional. Conclusion would force judgment, and judgment would require acknowledging that the castle was never sustainable. Not emotionally, not architecturally, not culturally. It was an object designed to overwhelm doubt, not coexist with it. Yet doubt won anyway. The original promise failed not because it was abandoned, but because it demanded permanence from something inherently temporary: human emotion, human life, human control. The castle asked stone to do what time refuses. Restoration did not change that equation. It only delayed its consequences. Today, the structure stands as a managed contradiction: loved but not needed, preserved but not used, explained but not understood. It functions as a symbol precisely because it cannot function as a home. That distinction matters. Homes adapt. Symbols resist adaptation. The castle resists change even as it requires it. That tension will never disappear. It will only shift forms. New standards, new expectations, new pressures. The system will keep asking for more because it was designed to. And eventually, someone will ask whether the asking itself is the problem. That moment hasn't arrived yet. For now, the castle remains just compelling enough to justify itself, just intact enough to avoid crisis, just fragile enough to demand vigilance. But vigilance has a cost too. It asks future caretakers to inherit a decision they did not make. to continue a story whose stakes they didn't set, to maintain an illusion of closure where none exists, and to do so politely without breaking the spell that draws people across the water. Because breaking the spell would reveal something uncomfortable, that the castle was never frozen in grief. It was frozen in escalation. Escalation of scale, of expectation, of obligation. The same force that built it too big to finish now keeps it too meaningful to abandon. That is the real loop. And loops don't end, they exhaust. One day, maintenance will become reconstruction again. One day, preservation will require alterations severe enough to challenge authenticity openly. One day, the cost will exceed the narrative's ability to justify it. When that happens, the question will return in its most honest form. Is this place being preserved because it deserves to endure, or because no one wants to be the one who lets it go? The castle offers no guidance on that decision. It never has. It simply stands, transferring the weight forward, generation by generation, asking the same thing it always asks: how much are you willing to give to keep a promise that was never fulfilled? The answer keeps changing. The structure remains, and the bill is still open. The castle's greatest illusion is stability. From a distance, it appears resolved. Stone towers balanced against the horizon. Restored halls catching light the way they were always meant to. Visitors move through designated paths, guided, reassured, convinced that what they are seeing is complete enough to be understood. But systems don't collapse from distance. They fail internally. What keeps Boldt Castle standing is not certainty, but constant correction. Adjustments layered on adjustment. Decisions made to postpone other decisions. This is not preservation in the romantic sense. It is containment, a controlled postponement of consequences. And postponement always borrows from the future. Every structure has a moment when it stops being inherited and starts being imposed. When caretakers no longer ask, should we keep this, and instead ask, how do we survive keeping it? That moment arrives quietly, not with collapse, but with fatigue. Fatigue shows up in smaller ways. Budgets tighten, repairs become selective, interpretations become safer, less honest. The story simplifies further because complexity is expensive to maintain. Romance is cheaper than reckoning. The castle becomes lighter in meaning and heavier in cost. This is where legacy fractures. Originally, the castle was meant to carry one message, privately. That message failed. What followed was not closure, but substitution. New meanings layered over the old, none strong enough to replace it completely. Love became tragedy. Tragedy became endurance. Endurance became attraction. At no point did the structure become necessary. Necessity is what gives buildings permission to change. Without it, change feels like betrayal. So the castle resists adaptation, even when adaptation would make it safer, cheaper, more honest. Every modification is negotiated as an exception, not an evolution. That rigidity is not architectural. It's emotional. The public does not want the castle to become something else. They want it to remain suspended, forever mid-gesture, forever about to be finished, forever about to mean something final. But suspended systems decay differently. They don't collapse outright. They hollow. Expertise drains first, then urgency, then justification. Eventually, the only thing holding the structure together is habit. Habit is dangerous. Habit keeps things alive long after their reason has expired. It confuses continuation with purpose. It mistakes familiarity for value. And once habit replaces intention, the end becomes inevitable. Not dramatic, but administrative. The castle will not fall in a storm. It will be revised, reclassified, deferred. And one day, quietly, the question will no longer be whether it should be preserved, but whether it can be. That moment will feel sudden to the public. It won't be. It will be the result of decades of accumulated avoidance, of choosing narrative over structure, of maintaining appearance instead of confronting design. The castle does not hide this fate. It announces it to anyone willing to look past the stone. Its rooms are too large for intimacy. Its corridors too formal for daily life. Its scale too assertive for flexibility. It was never built to age. It was built to overwhelm time, and time responded by waiting. Now time is patient. What Boldt Castle ultimately reveals is not the cost of love, but the cost of refusing limits, of believing that intention can override systems, of mistaking permanence for devotion. The structure still stands, but not as proof of success. It stands as evidence of transfer of burden, transfer of meaning, transfer of responsibility. Each generation inherits the illusion that it will be the one to resolve the tension. Each generation discovers that resolution would require letting something go, and letting go is the one act the castle was never designed to allow. So the cycle continued. Maintenance replaces memory. Narrative replaces judgment. Survival replaces purpose. The castle becomes less about what happened there and more about why it still matters. And that question grows harder to answer the longer it remains unchallenged. The house is still standing. The name is still spoken. The water still reflects the towers. But the price never stopped accumulating. It was simply divided among those who came after.